How are you guys? Having fun so far today? I'm going to cap out the end of the day. So I have a confession to make. I can't see any of you. The lights are so bright in the back. So I'm going to pretend there's like maybe 2 of you in here. Hopefully there's more. I'm really excited to be here in Toronto. I feel like I'm a Californian. I'm a Canadian trapped in the body of a Californian, unfortunately. I am a huge ice hockey fan, and to me, like coming to Toronto is kind of like a religious experience. I mean, you guys have the Hockey Hall of Fame here, right? So really excited to get out and see the Centennial exhibit again, because I saw it in May, but it was worth going back for. A little bit about me professionally. So I started doing software development after finishing college. That was back in 1998. Back when the web was kind of a new thing. I started doing development with Notepad and Internet Explorer 5.5. I have had a long career of doing front-end specific software development and joined Google back in 2009. I started there on an ads product and then moved over to working on search and more recently assistant-based products. I recently switched teams at Google from search, where I was there for about 5 years, over to Google Play, where I run the UX engineering team for that ecosystem. So digging into the content that I prepared for you guys today, the title of my talk is Storytelling with Software, and we are big fans of storytelling in UX at Google. This is a quote that comes from a man named Kaushal Shah, who I have the pleasure of working with on a regular basis at Google, and he says that we tend to think of prototyping as storytelling. The stronger your story, the more compelling argument you can make. This is a really fantastic quote. We are, as designers, storytellers. We just tend to tell our stories with pixels and ink. Okay? There's a real power to really great storytelling, though, and that's because stories are often memorable, impactful, and personal. As a matter of fact, a study was done a couple of years ago with a bunch of students in university, and each one of those students was asked to give a 1-minute pitch to their fellow classmates. Now, across those pitches in that classroom, each of the students incorporated about 2 to 3 stats per presentation. But only 1 in 10 of those students told a story. At the end of those presentations, their instructor asked them to write down things that they remembered. And the interesting thing is that of all the stats that were presented, only 5% remembered any of those stats. But 63% remembered the stories. Now, at the end of my talk, I'm going to ask you which stats you guys remembered. Hopefully none of them, because the story's good. We'll find out. So to me, some really fantastic examples of great stories. They come in all different shapes and sizes. I mean, we're talking about classics like Moby Dick or Casablanca, or one of my favorites, Star Wars. These are all fantastic examples of really great storytelling. Now, in order to tell a really great story, which is what I want to do today, we need to answer a bunch of questions, right? So this is the old English 101 course. We need to answer the 5W and 1H questions. So in this case, that would be what, who, when, where, how, and why. And I realize that normally you hear who, what, where, when, and how. I've messed with the order just a little bit in order to tell my story today, so bear with me just a little. The questions we want to answer today include, what's a prototype? Who should make prototypes? When is the best time to make a prototype? Where should prototypes be made? How are prototypes made? And I think most importantly, why should we be making prototypes? So let's start off with the first question. What is a prototype? And because I work at Google, I turn to Google and ask this question. What is a prototype? Interestingly, we get their response that says a first typical or preliminary model of something, especially a machine, from which other forms are developed or copied. Like Google, that sounds very, very academic and very scientific. So I turn to Wikipedia. Okay? And Wikipedia tells us that a prototype is an early sample, model, or release of a product built to test a concept or process, or to act as a thing to be replicated or learned from. Now, this, to me, this definition really resonates. I really like this one. Okay? So I think it deserves to be unpacked just a bit. Okay? So the first part of that definition says, an early sample or release of a product. That's great. We do this all the time, right? Even in the normal act of building software, we do early releases, okay, to get an early look at that stuff. It's built to test a concept or a process. Prototypes are fantastic vehicles for doing this, testing concepts. And I think the most important part of this definition is the act, the thing to be learned from. So a prototype is the thing to be learned from. And they allow us to focus on better understanding the problem we're tasked with solving. It's not so much about the act of finding the solution. Prototyping is going to help us go down that road. Okay? It's a journey, and that's really the most important thing. The interesting thing is that most often, making a prototype means faking an experience. And sometimes we want to fake these experiences so that we can answer the burning questions that we have about our design or our work. So you might ask questions. In the effort to find min viability for our products, you might ask questions like which platform you want to build for or target for. Is it iOS? Is it Android? Or is it the web? Are we developing this for a mobile form factor or perhaps a desktop form factor? Or perhaps there's a hardware component to go with it. The important thing is to ask the questions and let the prototype drive the answers for you. The interesting thing is to have a clear set of questions you're trying to answer and prototype only what you need to build to address those questions. At Google, we've actually have a spectrum of prototyping methods, and so I'd like to introduce a couple of those to you. First and foremost, at the lo-fi end of the spectrum is sketching and paper prototyping. And this is really interesting to me because sketching and lo-fi paper prototyping has a low barrier to entry. It's really fantastic for collaboration. And this is the area where you can leverage your peers to help you ideate much more quickly. There's a lot of different activities that it can include live sketching and paper prototyping, things like design sprints that I'll talk about a little later on. The thing to understand here, though, is that sketching and paper prototyping requires no startup costs at all. You can do this with your engineers, your PMs, your designers, even your end users. That's the great thing about this. Now, in the middle of the fidelity spectrum, we have what I would call a design vignette or a micro interaction. And there are digital prototyping tools, things like Principle, Origami Studio, that are really fantastic at developing these types of prototypes. Often, they're made to test a single concept. You press a button, you open a dialogue, and repeat. Okay? Now, the really fantastic thing about this is, the proliferation of tools across the UX ecosystem, but also the fact that you as a designer don't need to ask somebody like me, an engineer, to help you build your prototype. You can do this in tools that are already familiar to you. And at the upper end of the fidelity spectrum is something that we do a lot of at Google as UX engineers. We build these stakeholder narratives, these core user journeys with code. So you might ask, oh, wait a minute, are you actually building applications specifically for the purpose of prototyping, specifically for the purpose of testing? And the answer is absolutely, yes, we are. Now, these are higher fidelity. They're more complete flows. As a matter of fact, it might actually be built on top of existing production software. Okay? These are often time-consuming to create because they require a huge investment from not only one engineer, but maybe a group of people, including researchers and designers. I think the key takeaway from this first section is that prototypes are meant to be learned from. And just like stories, can take a variety of shapes and sizes. You have things like poems, articles, novels, even comic books and pulp fiction I would throw in there. And just like other stories, prototypes can be experienced in a bunch of different form factors. So the second question we want to answer today is, who should make prototypes? And I think this is actually an easy question to answer, right? At Google, we involve designers, researchers, engineers, writers, stakeholders, and even end users in the prototyping process. And the asterisk is there on this slide because I think prototyping should be done by anyone and everyone. This is not an exclusive activity, and I think one that's actually really important to the product development lifecycle. That said, at Google, we have a specialized role for prototyping and front-end development. We're called UX engineers. So UX engineering came about the last couple of years. I actually predate the UX engineering ladder at Google. I was hired into a role called UI developer. As of September, so this month, we have 241 UX engineers working at Google. The last time I gave this talk was back in May, and we've grown from the 233 to 241. I think that's really fantastic growth in this. And part of the reason why I'm here today is to talk a little bit more about UX engineering and broaden the reach for that community and bring more of you guys into the fold. So what is UX engineering? To me, there's a really big gap in this spectrum of skills. Okay? On the left side of this, you have visual and interaction design. And on the right, you have product engineering. But there's a really big continuum that's missing in the middle. And this is where UX engineering fills this gap at Google. And we have two specializations in UX engineering. There's basically a set of skills and ways of measuring performance, and we can move between these lenses kind of at will within Google. It's actually kind of fun to do that. As I mentioned, I've been an 8-year veteran of Google, and I'm actually on my now 4th major project there. So the UX engineering ladder actually has two lenses of specialization. On the right-hand side, we have the engineering lens. These folks typically report into the SWE engineering hierarchy. They build products, tools, and libraries with the production engineering teams. They're writing production quality code that's stored in our code repositories. We work closely with designers for pixel-perfect implementation. We master Google's technology stack, including all of its idiosyncrasies. And we often specialize to a platform, iOS, web, or Android. On the other side, we have the design lens. These folks typically report into a UX manager. We typically build prototypes, tools, and frameworks that aid the design process. We work closely with researchers in addition to designers to answer those product questions before they end up in the engineering lifecycle. We learn to master all of the prototyping fidelities, sketching all the way up through writing production-level code. And we may also contribute to product design, especially at higher levels. A couple of highlights from UX engineering that I see are really interesting to talk to you guys about. The first would be product and experiential prototyping. With a healthy mix of things like digital tools and prototyping in code at the higher end of the fidelity spectrum, we're using things like Framer.js and Principle, right? And we're building these in order to fully experience the software direction, the design direction that we're hoping to go in before we productionize. Okay? And these are examples of some of the prototypes that we've built over the last few years. These are examples out of my time in search. So for instance, we built the Olympics experience here. And one of the things that we were hoping to test here was, would this Olympics experience scale to an international audience? Would they understand, for instance, the fab on the right-hand side is actually a speed dial for a lot of the different things like medal standings? Was that feature discoverable? On the other hand, we've also been looking at more core features to the search experience. So this is an example of our knowledge graph and searching for Harry Potter information. As UX engineers, we also delve often into the deep end of the uncharted territory. We're going boldly into areas of software engineering that others have not yet gone into. A great example of this would be actually building our assistant in the last couple of years. Voice-based UX is a relatively new thing. Okay? And some of these concepts are legitimately novel. In this particular example, I'm actually showing you guys something called our anthropomorphic audio testing tool. And what this gave us the opportunity to do was test things like how a computer might interrupt you. Now, it's one thing if you and I are having a conversation and we say, you know what, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. But what happens when the other thing on the other end of the line is not another human being? What's the expectation there? How are you going to be interrupted? How would you want to be interrupted? And so we're building tools like this to test these concepts. This is an interesting process in and of itself because, UX, as I mentioned, voice UX was kind of an unheard of discipline until very recently. So going boldly into these uncharted territories allows us to fully understand what resonates with you guys, our users, most. The third and final thing that I'd like to highlight as far as UX engineering contributions here, bootstrapping our design teams. So I'd like to ask a question real quick. You guys in the audience, how many of you guys use Sketch for your daily work? That's a good chunk of you guys. Sketch is almost ubiquitous at Google, particularly in search and in Google Play, where I am today. The interesting thing is that we need to actually build tools to aid our design teams to do a better job, to fully understand where their designs break down and decompose. So this is an example of a tool that we built for Sketch. And this tool uses mustache-like placeholders, like the double curly braces, mustache-like placeholders to inject live data from one of our search APIs directly into your design mocks. Okay? This is really valuable because, being a child of engineering on the web, right, from the 90s and the early 2000s, whenever we built a box, right, we designed our boxes and then we put content into it, and because we used those old 9-patch grids, our boxes would often break very quickly, especially when you start throwing words at it like in German, right? Let's talk about the word Gewürztraminer for a minute, right? That's a huge word. This Sketch plugin gives our designers that opportunity to see what real live data looks like in their mocks, and thereby shortens the life cycle to productionization because they're able to discover those edge cases before they've involved somebody like an engineer. Okay? So bootstrapping our design partners is a really critical exercise of UX engineering at Google. Being a UX engineer at Google is a lot like having a great idea for landing a spaceship on Mars. You could start by dropping eggs with parachutes from your roof and realize that you missed a few important details. In the next prototypes, you'll incorporate those ideas. When the spaceship lands on Mars, your quick prototype's big ideas will be visible. I think this quote really exemplifies, to me personally, what it means to be a UX engineer. Being able to see our ideas compound upon one another, right? I mean, success is really built on top of compounding failure, and being able to learn from that failure is the critical activity of a UX engineer. And I think the most important thing about UX teams working together, right, is learning from those failures, learning what does not resonate with our users. So being like a UX engineer is a fantastic opportunity. Okay? So back to our core story. The next question we want to answer is, when is the best time to make a prototype? And I'd say that the product development lifecycle could probably be broken down into these 4 major phases. Okay? There's the problem statement, there's pitching ideas, there's solutions finding, and finally the implementation phase. And I think prototyping fits really well into the middle 2 parts of this, in pitch and solutions finding. That said, prototyping can actually work across any one of these 4 phases. You could be prototyping to identify new and novel problems to solve. You could be doing pitch identification, right? So your stakeholders come to you with a problem. Your product lacks stickiness. You need to pitch some solutions. So you go through the pitching process. You come up with 3 or 4 different ideas. You lay them out. You identify a solution based on what resonated in those prototypes, not only with your end users, but with your stakeholders as well. And finally, into implementation, and I think prototyping can actually end up in implementation as well. At Google, that takes the form of A/B testing. And for example, in search, you guys use search on a daily basis. There are literally thousands of A/B experiments running in search every day. And these are really fantastic ways of helping to identify solutions, right? Driving towards the ultimate goal of presenting a delightful user interaction. So next question, where should prototypes be made? And I think this is actually an easy question to answer too. At Google, prototyping most often manifests itself in brainstorms, cafe studies, design sprints, and stakeholder reviews. There are folks like me who prototype on a daily basis, but generally speaking, we involve the majority of the UX team in these activities, and I'd like to deep dive into a couple of them. First up, prototyping is part of design sprints. So the idea of design sprints actually originated with the Agile methodology. How many of you guys have used or looked at Agile in the past? Quite a number of you, that's great. So prototyping evolved from the Agile processes, and it was actually an evolution from IDEO, which is a design agency, as well as the D School at Stanford, the Stanford Design School. Okay? These frameworks were adapted to the idea of design sprints, thanks to the Google UX teams, folks over at Google Ventures and Google X, as well as teams across the rest of the industry. While sprints are really popular at Google, they're also becoming more ubiquitous at startups and other organizations. Now, design sprints actually go through 6 phases, right? And they typically are at least 1 to 5 days in length. So, those 6 phases: understanding, defining your direction, considering divergent ideas, deciding on your direction, prototyping, my personal favorite, and then I think the ultimate act of why we're prototyping is to validate the direction that we're going in. Okay? I would implore you, I'll publish my slides after the talk, and I would implore you to actually look up the design sprint methodology from Google. The second thing I'd like to highlight as an activity for UX and for UX engineering is collaborating with researchers. This is a huge part of why we prototype at Google. This is such a critical activity. This is so that we can understand the value of the features that we're trying to launch in front of you. In Google, we do large and small scale studies just the same. So as an example, we do cafe studies every day on campus. We have a number of cafes, much like a college university, and we get a ton of visitors to campus. And it's very common to see a researcher parked in front of one of those cafes asking folks for their feedback, right? Google is a really large organization, so we oftentimes use ourselves for studying as well, right? To try and understand, can we get a little bit of directional information? Can we get a little bit of validation? At the other end of the spectrum, though, we have things like our DIN study, our Daily Information Needs Study, okay? Well, what is that? DIN is actually a very large-scale study that we're running in places like India, right? Google has a very large initiative called NBU, which is our next billion users, okay? We're looking to find when, where, and how users want to engage with Google in those types of markets. So it's one thing, for instance, to use your Maps product in a place like Toronto or San Francisco, where I am. But what about going someplace like Mumbai? If they're looking for their local startup or their local Starbucks, are they going to have the same experience that I am? Probably not. Chances are they're not even looking for Starbucks in Mumbai, right? So, we actually do this stuff so that we can do things like track happiness, track engagement, to recognize patterns across our design work that we can distill and reuse across multiple products. So this is a visualization, actually, of one of our DIN studies. The power of generating these visualizations is that research across the entirety of our enterprise has access to that data. So we had a UX engineer build this visualization, but UX engineers also go out into the field with our research teams, prototyping on the fly. It's very common for a UX engineer to sit in on one of our research studies and modify the prototype as we gain deeper understanding. So how are prototypes made? We at Google build from the foundation of human-centered design. That's something that you guys have heard a lot about today, I think. And it's a really fantastic process. It's a 3-phase process, and it starts with inspiration. That's the deeply understanding your users and immersing yourself in their world. Analogous to our DIN studies at Google, going out into the communities and understanding what those users are interested in with our products. Then there's ideation, which makes sense of what you're learning, identifies opportunities to design and continue prototyping possible solutions. And then there's the 3rd phase, where you're bringing your ideas to life through implementation. Check out the design kit by IDEO. It's a fantastic framework for doing design and prototyping in your own world. When making prototypes, you have to choose the right fidelity, okay? And the right fidelity is based 100% on context. It's about striking a balance between where you are in the design lifecycle and what the goals of your project are. There's low and medium and high fidelity prototypes, and they all come with their own costs. And providing the right context for your idea is the crucial thing. So I've got an example of one of our prototypes that we built a couple of years ago for our base maps product. And this should illustrate the length and extent we're willing to go to prototype. We actually had a designer cut out all of those layers. This is a paper prototype. And what we were hoping to understand with this prototype is two things. How does natural light impact our ability to understand a map? And how does color play a role in that as well? Okay? So in this particular prototype, we're looking at how the layers composite themselves over one another. Do people understand, for instance, that roads are higher elevation, and with that elevation have more prominence in the landscape? We get a real sense of like depth and, again, natural light and how it applies to the design. Now, we went through quite a bit of work to build this particular prototype. We learned a lot from it. We learned, again, about natural light, about shadow, and things like that. Your prototype might actually have a different goal, and so you might choose a different fidelity for your prototype. You might end up in the design vignette world where you're using digital prototyping tools. Or you might actually find yourself writing an A/B branch in your application. The important thing is to choose the fidelity for your prototyping that's best going to serve your needs and answer your questions as soon as possible. Okay? Prototyping is about min viability. It's not about complete features. It's not about complete understanding. It's about understanding the answer to one question, the first question you need to answer. Okay? Choosing the right tools is also a critical activity for prototyping, and there's a huge proliferation of tools, right? They're literally growing off trees these days. Taylor Palmer has actually produced a list of all of the prototyping tools ever, and this is a screenshot of that. And I think, tools are a layer of abstraction on top of the prototyping activity, right? They provide the framework, the foundation for which we can build those prototypes. Live preview on your mobile device, for example, would be one of them. Some prototyping tools actually come with a suite of components already built in. Cards, typographic elements, things like that, to make the act of prototyping much simpler. Going up in the fidelity, you end up with coding tools. Things like Xcode and Android Studio. The important thing is to choose the right tool that fits your problem, the context of your solutions finding activity. So a few examples and case studies from our work at Google. So I talked a little bit about design sprints, and prototyping is a really huge part of our design sprint methodology. It's a highly collaborative environment, often crossing multiple disciplinary boundaries. You're including PM, Eng, and UX. Oftentimes, these prototypes are at the low fidelity end of the spectrum and require a ton of iteration. The other interesting thing is because design sprints are a week or less, there's very little time, which means ramping up on a digital prototyping tool is probably not going to be your best choice. Paper fits really well in this kind of environment because it is a vehicle for fantastic collaboration. I've done a bunch of design sprints with engineers. Some really serious engineers at Google, right? Folks, for instance, that are keeping the lights on in our data centers, our site reliability engineering teams. We did some design sprints with those folks to understand the next evolution of their products. What does it mean to manage a data center inside of Google, right? We have a ton of them. But what does it mean to do that? So we sat them down and we asked them to draw some pictures. And all of them initially were like, nope, can't do it. Not a designer. I don't draw. But what we're asking them to do is draw simple boxes and arrows and explain their idea. Really, the prototypes here are about capturing those ideas for use at a later phase of the sprint methodology. So again, paper plays a really great role here because there is no barrier to entry. People just write, just draw. Using tools like Principle and Pixate require specific skills and are probably not a great fit for this environment. You as an engineer or you as a PM, do you really want to learn a design tool in order to express your ideas? I don't think that that's critical. I think being able to draw and write works fantastically well. The second example I'll share with you is a product onboarding experience. We've got a mobile UI here. Users can advance the UI by swiping left or right. There's animation, which is important part of this experience, right? How does the animation work when we switch from screen to screen? And it should feel like a native app, but we're on a tight deadline. So which tool would you use? This, to me, is where some of these digital prototyping tools, Pixate or Origami Studio, for example, fill the need quite well. Because they're a design tool, these are things that designers feel comfortable with. And oftentimes, like Origami Studio, for example, has direct import and export from Sketch. Again, shortening the life cycle from design to implementation. The thing is that because this requires something like a digital prototyping tool to get the interaction fidelity correct, we're pressing a button, we're swiping. We want to know if users end up getting to the end of the onboarding experience. And if they don't make it to the end, where do they fall off? Was that loss of user, was that triggered by what? Bad UI, bad animations? We're not quite sure, but that's why we're building the prototype. The last example I'll give is like a dashboard usability study. This is another thing that we do quite a bit at Google. We actually build full experiences like this into our products. So this would be perhaps A/B testing. Perhaps it's actually not A/B testing, and we're actually just trying to build a new feature and see how far we can get with it. This particular study was for a desktop product with a multi-page workflow. Now that part is, I think, an interesting thing for this prototype. Design tools, digital design tools, are a little bit difficult about getting all of those transitions right, particularly if your page goes down a really large flow. Building these things, these types of tools in code, gives us a chance to really investigate those flows, the information architecture of the experience. And in this case, maybe we want to test multiple variations of an existing feature. We want realistic user data, which necessitates us using one of our live data APIs. And it needs to feel real. So now, up here on this slide, I've included HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I think that would get the job done most effectively here. I've also thrown up AC. That's a proprietary Google technology. I give this talk both inside and out of Google. It's essentially an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework specific to our ads products. But you also have tools like Framer.js and Axure here. And while I think they would do a reasonable job, Framer, for instance, suffers because long page flows are very difficult to implement with that particular tool. Okay? So carefully considering not only the problem that you're trying to solve for, the solution you're attempting to put into place, but you need to consider which tools you're going to apply in that process. I don't think paper prototyping would solve this problem very effectively. We need to experience it on desktop device. We want our researchers to be able to drive our end users through these experiences such that they actually can gain an understanding of what is resonating with users and what is not. So this, I think, is the bread and butter of my talk. Why is it important to make prototypes? This is the, I think, essential message. So first and foremost, we want to build a shared understanding of our idea. So user experience design is not an individual sport, right? To that end, we need to leverage prototypes to get that 360-degree view around our problem space. In engineering, my domain, we ask what's feasible? What can we get done in that time frame? From the user experience perspective, we're starting to ask what's desirable to our end users. What do they want from our software? And from the PM, marketing, sales, and strategy side of the house, we're asking what's going to make our experience profitable? By building a shared understanding and centering your conversation on a prototype, you gain perspective from all of these constituencies across your organization. You'll build a more full-featured experience that does a better job of meeting your business needs. You'll be able to foster a deeper understanding of your users' needs as well. Oftentimes, we as designers like to hold our work very close to our chest. I know I'm certainly guilty of this. But getting our ideas out there, getting feedback often and frequently is essential to our success and to understanding of what direction our users want us to go with our products. Okay? The really interesting thing here is that when you ask for feedback, you ought to consider sending a request ahead of time, getting a little bit of insight and priming the conversation. Being able to do that will help you focus that conversation around your prototype. You'll be able to test and iterate effectively with your user research team who are charged with collecting that feedback. Your prototypes will help them do that. And because sometimes we fall victim to holding our design work close to our chest, we fall in love with our first design. And because this happens, we need to use prototyping to validate that we're on the right path. Using the stock photo here, we've got a car in a testing rig, and they're about to smash something else into it. Now, the interesting thing is that we've gotten much better about building cars over time because our understanding of building cars and what cars are used for has improved. We did that by prototyping the experiences. And we still do this with auto manufacturing today. This is a huge part of the activity. This is my personal favorite. Communicating effectively to stakeholders and users alike. Okay. There is no better vehicle than a prototype itself. When I started at Google, we used to do presentations, and we used to set our mocks up on the wall. And we used to have our execs walk by, and we would talk through the mocks as we went through them. The difficulty, though, is that there's a lot of subjectivity when you're talking about going from mock A to mock B. How do we transition between those two? How do we effectively get from A to B? Mocks really don't tell that story effectively. There's a lot of subjectivity to it, and a lot is left up to the imagination of the person looking at those mocks. And because there is an imagination involved, maybe you and I have different expectations about how it's going to work. By centering your conversation on a prototype, you take all of that lack of expectations and you level the playing field. Because it's something you can feel. You are centering the conversation around that prototype. Now, I use stakeholders and users alike here on this slide, and I think that's an interesting thing to talk a little bit about. Our stakeholders are our users at Google. We use Google just like you guys do, day in and day out, to answer our information needs. Okay? But we don't always have the answer. I'm not from India, for example, so I don't know what a user of our Maps products in Mumbai is looking for, but I need to get out into the field to understand it. And taking that prototype out into the field will help our UX team understand those end users much better. And this is kind of the last, I think, tenet of why prototyping is pretty critical. It'll help you collaborate more effectively with your peers. Collaboration, right? I mean, a couple of slides ago I said that design is not an individual sport, and that couldn't be truer than at a place like Google. We have 8 different UX specializations at Google. It's a huge organization. And as a result, we must collaborate effectively as peers. Otherwise, no work gets done. Okay? So prototyping here provides that vehicle. It helps us eliminate the politics of the decision-making process. And because we can eliminate that political battle, we're then talking about the same thing, helping us find that shared vision, that shared understanding of our product direction. So I'd like to leave you with a few guiding principles. This is kind of my philosophical section of my talk, my UX philosophy section. So the first thing I've learned as a prototyper over the last bunch of years is that failure is always an option. And really, just like the slide says here, prototyping is just as much about learning what our users do want as what they don't. And it's far more common in the prototyping process that you're going to discover something about your product direction that you didn't know before. That's the value prop in prototyping right there. It's important to let go of your attachments and embrace compromise with enthusiasm. Okay? Oftentimes we end up falling in love with our first design, and we take that to market and we don't understand why we've missed the mark. By taking that prototype out into the marketplace much sooner, we get a very valid perspective that perhaps doesn't match our own. And when it does not match our own perspective, we have to go out and compromise. And prototyping allows us to find those compromises with enthusiasm and put them into our product. I love this photo of this cheesy kid. Some folks have already talked about active listening, and I won't deep dive into it, but I want to say that this is a critical activity, particularly for those of us at Google, right? Google is a huge organization. So the act of active listening is important for us to be able to communicate with one another. And like the slide says here, listening is one of the most important skills you have. How well you listen has a major impact on your job effectiveness. If you have your ears closed and your mouth open, what understanding will you gain? The act of active listening is being able to listen to what your users are telling you, summarize and reflect that back to them in a meaningful way. We do this with prototypes. By prototyping those experiences, we're showing them, quite literally on device, what they've told us. We've found that enthusiastic compromise and we're putting it into their hands. And by continuing to listen to them and going through this process repetitively, we gain that understanding so that we can put really first-class products that scale out to the entire world. This is something that I don't think gets quite enough love at UX conferences, and it's the notion of designing for breakpoints and iteration. And this is applying human-centered design, the process of inspiration, ideation, and implementation. And this is where the rinse and repeat comes in and is really, really important. By building in these breakpoints, by stopping to gather feedback, by showing your stakeholders what you've been doing, you're bringing visibility to your work. You're bringing visibility to the problems you're attempting to solve. And, I think most critically, the solutions you're hoping to put into place. Keeping a record of your progress, measuring your success, and making time to celebrate is something that we do quite a bit at Google, and something that I hadn't experienced at other organizations in the past. We use something called OKRs, Objectives and Key Results, to measure our progress at Google. But I implore you to actually adopt a similar process. This measuring your success part is particularly, I think, important because we don't do it enough. Not only celebrating our progress, but celebrating our understanding of the direction that we're going in with our product. Practicing strengths building and investing in learning is also something that I don't see very often outside of Google. And I would implore you, particularly those of you guys who freelance or work for agencies, this is something that is critical to your success and your career. The number one thing that I've learned in my career, absolutely, is that lifelong learning is essential. You don't graduate from university knowing all the skills you're going to know for the rest of your life. You need to learn. You need to adapt. You need to grow. So by taking advantage of your downtime in your client work, for instance, at Google, we tend not to ship software around the holidays. There's a couple of different reasons for that. A, it's a big product purchasing time of year, right? Lots of people shopping. Second, a lot of people are out on vacation. So if that critical bug pops up, it's probably not the best time of the year. So what do we tend to do with our time? We invest in strengths building. We go back to school. We invest in learning. We invest in cleaning up technical debt in our projects or design debt in our projects. But it's that investment in learning, investment in strengths building that you can double down on in your organization. Being able to invest in this sense, give your people time to learn on the job. Otherwise, you're forcing them to do it off cycle. And I don't know about you, but when I go home, I want to go home. I don't want to crack open a book. I don't want to read a website. And I certainly don't want to practice coding when I get there. Okay? I want to spend time with my family. So those of you guys who manage folks, make time in your team, for your team, to do this stuff. We're at a conference, and so I think I need to throw this slide in here, which is to go guerrilla with your user testing. I mentioned at Google we do tons and tons of cafe studies, right? We actually pester folks at all of our cafes. And I would argue that you could do the same thing, especially as a freelancer. You guys like to work from coffee shops and things like that. Why not, next time you're there, go tap somebody in line on the shoulder and offer to buy them a coffee? All you have to do is say, hey, you know what? Can I have 5 minutes of your time? I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee if you'll give me 5 minutes worth of feedback on my idea. You put your prototype in their hands, and you actively listen to what they're saying to you. Take notes, ask questions, and reflect on the information you're getting. But there is no better place than something like a coffee shop for that. Not only to mention, you'll actually probably be doing a little bit of networking, because it's possible that that other person is a freelancer too. Maybe you're a designer who found a researcher or an engineer to partner with. Could be a good opportunity. The last thing I'll leave you with is beware of some common pitfalls when you prototype. So this is not a one-size-fits-all operation or anything like that. And sometimes we get it wrong. And certainly we've fallen victim to this stuff at Google, right? We've fallen victim to fixating on the artifact instead of the understanding. This is something, for instance, when we were in the early stages of material design, we got very fixated on the concept of elegance. But what we learned when we went and started prototyping and started putting our prototypes in the hands of our users is that elegance that we were looking for didn't resonate with our users at all. So we learned something valuable. Unfortunately, it took us a little too long to do that. Jared Spool's got a fantastic article on the prevalent pitfalls of prototyping, and I implore you to look it up and read it. He talks a bit about some of these other concepts, converging too soon, neglecting to test your work with real people, or one of the things I also fall victim to is over-engineering my prototypes. So this slide is here because, well, we were just talking about prototyping pitfalls, and this is a GIF of the old school 8-bit game Pitfall. This is actually the first video game that I learned to play. I love it. It's near and dear to my heart. The essential takeaway here, though, is that I'd like you guys to be like this guy and nail it every time. Use prototypes to effectively enhance your process, to understand your users a little bit better, and to hit the nail on the head. So in closing, we asked a bunch of questions today. Who should make prototypes? What are prototypes? When is the best time to prototype? And why is prototyping important? And the message that I wanted to share with you guys today is to tell your stories better with prototypes. You'll be more effective at scaling your design process using these common prototyping methods that I've introduced to you today, and by avoiding common pitfalls. You'll foster a deeper understanding of your users' needs by getting serious about collecting user feedback. You'll be able to build a shared understanding of your idea and validate your design thinking with real users on real devices. And lastly, you'll be able to win the hearts and minds of your peers and stakeholders by eliminating the subjectivity in the decision-making process with your prototype. I'll close with this quote. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a prototype is worth 10,000. Prototypes go beyond the power of show and tell. They let you experience the design. Thank you.